My name is Nathaniel Sterling. I am 34 years old, and for 12 years my family acted like I was already dead. It happened at my father's annual Christmas gala. I was standing in the grand hall of the Hartford Club when my father looked at my plain black coat and said, loud enough for 200 elite guests to hear, "Do we really have to stand next to a homeless-looking man from New York?" My brother Julian leaned in and whispered, "Don't embarrass me, Nate. These people are above you." I stayed completely silent. But there was one thing they didn't know. The host of that gala, the most powerful CEO in the room, was about to walk right past my father, shake my hand, and call me his boss. And today, the very people who threw me away are the ones begging for a second chance. Before I tell you how this masterclass in quiet revenge actually happened, hit that like button if you believe that true power doesn't need to shout. And drop a comment telling me what city or state you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to the ballroom where the illusion shattered. The grand hall of the Hartford Club smelled of roasted winter pine, old money, and the sharp, metallic tang of chilled champagne. It was the kind of room where the lighting was deliberately designed to make diamonds catch the eye while keeping the corners draped in a polite, expensive shadow. Oil paintings of 19th-century Connecticut industrialists stared down from the oak-paneled walls, their painted eyes offering the same practiced dismissal as the living guests standing below them. I stood near the massive, 15-foot Christmas tree, wearing a plain, slightly worn black wool coat that I hadn't bothered to check at the door, and a pair of dark leather Oxfords that had seen far too many miles of New York City concrete. My father, Charles Sterling, didn't even drop his baritone voice when he spotted me. He was standing 3 feet away, a fresh crystal flute of Dom Perignon balanced in his manicured hand. "Do we really have to stand next to a homeless-looking man from New York?" he asked. His smile remained plastered on his face, perfectly wide, perfectly hollow, crafted specifically for the benefit of the state senator standing to his left. My younger brother, Julian, the golden child, the sole heir to the Sterling family legacy, stepped into my field of vision. He was 28 now, wearing a bespoke velvet dinner jacket that probably cost more than the average American's monthly salary. He leaned in, his cologne thick enough to choke on, his voice dropping into a sharp, urgent hiss. "Don't embarrass me, Nate. These people are above you. Just grab a drink, stand in the back, and keep your mouth shut." I didn't move. I didn't defend myself. I didn't offer a witty comeback or show a single flicker of the rage that would have consumed the 22-year-old version of me. I just watched them. I watched my stepmother, Evelyn, standing slightly behind my father. She performed a small, exquisite adjustment of her diamond tennis bracelet. A tiny, deliberate physical signal to anyone watching that she recognized the social stain I represented, and had actively chosen to remain entirely untouched by it. The conversations nearby faltered. A woman in a backless emerald dress pressed her lips together, her eyes sliding over my faded coat with the quiet, profound satisfaction of witnessing someone else's public disgrace. They looked at me and saw the ghost of Charles Sterling's first marriage. The son who had vanished into the merciless grind of Manhattan and predictably failed. Then, the heavy brass doors at the east end of the ballroom swung open. Alexander Thorne had arrived. If Charles Sterling was a big fish in the comfortable, static pond of Hartford real estate, Alexander Thorne was the leviathan that owned the ocean. Thorne Capital didn't return phone calls from men like my father. They bought the banks that held my father's mortgages. Thorne moved through the room with the terrifying, unhurried grace of a man who measured his time in fiscal quarters rather than minutes. I watched my father's posture instantly mutate. The arrogant patriarch evaporated, replaced by a sweating, desperate climber. Charles surged forward, practically stepping on Evelyn's gown to intercept Thorne near the ice sculpture. He thrust his hand out, his chest puffing forward in a pathetic attempt to manufacture an equal standing. "Alexander, Charles Sterling, incredible triumph of an evening you've hosted here. I'd love to get you on my calendar next week to discuss the commercial real estate expansion." Alexander Thorne offered a polite, sterile nod. He shook my father's hand for exactly 1.5 seconds. Then his eyes drifted right past Charles's perfectly parted silver hair, tracked across the silent ballroom, and locked onto me. Thorn didn't excuse himself. He simply walked through the space my father was trying to claim. The ambient hum of the ballroom died. You could hear the ice settling in the cocktail glasses. Thorn stopped 2 feet in front of me, unbuttoned his topcoat, and offered a warm, highly out-of-character smile. "Nathaniel," Thorn said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the frozen room. "You're late." The car was waiting downstairs for 20 minutes. My father materialized at Thorn's elbow, his social radar spinning into absolute, frantic confusion. He looked at Thorn, then looked at my scuffed Oxfords. "Alexander, you two know each other?" my father asked, his voice cracking slightly, the false lightness failing to cover the sudden spike of genuine alarm. Alexander Thorn slowly turned his head. He looked at Charles Sterling not as a fellow businessman, but the way a homeowner looks at a termite. "Know him?" Thorn repeated, the words dropping like heavy iron anvils into the quiet air. "Charles, aren't you going to introduce me to your boss?" To understand the absolute, suffocating terror that just hijacked my father's face. "We have to stop the clock right here. We have to leave the crystal chandeliers, the silk ties, and the smell of expensive champagne. We have to rewind the tape 12 years, back to a freezing Saturday afternoon in Connecticut, when I was young enough to believe that a father's love was something you could earn." The heavy oak door of my father's study shut with a solid, airtight thud that felt like a vault locking. It was the April of my senior year at Stanford. I had just flown back to Connecticut on a red-eye flight, my backpack stuffed with 3 competitive junior analyst job offers from top-tier Wall Street firms, and an official letter confirming I was graduating in the top 1% of my class. I had practiced the conversation in the airplane bathroom 3 times. I thought the ink on those Wall Street letterheads would finally be the currency that bought Charles Sterling's respect. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his hands lightly clasped over a pristine leather blotter. Evelyn stood beside his high-back chair, her hand resting on his shoulder in a display of unified, impenetrable authority. "Sit down, Nathaniel," my father said. I sat in the stiff leather chair opposite him, the same chair where, at age 10, I had been told my mother had passed away, the same chair where, at age 14, I was told Evelyn was moving in and my mother's old piano was being donated to make room for Julian's private French tutor. "Evelyn and I have been reviewing your situation," my father began. "Not my achievements, not my graduation, my situation, like a zoning dispute on a piece of commercial real estate. I have 3 offers in Manhattan, Dad," I said, keeping my voice level, pulling the crisp folders from my bag. "Goldman, Morgan Stanley, and a specialized quantitative fund in Midtown. I start the 2nd week of June." My father didn't reach for the folders. He didn't even look at them. He sighed, a long, heavy sound engineered to communicate the exhausting burden of dealing with an inherently defective child. "New York is a meat grinder, Nathaniel, and those firms recruit thousands of boys just like you every spring. You have no family network there. You have no trust fund to fall back on when they cut you loose after 80 hours a week of grunt work. It lacks stability." He leaned forward, deploying his practiced boardroom negotiation voice. "We have a better strategy. Julian is entering prep school this fall. Eventually, he will be stepping in to manage the primary operations of Sterling Enterprises. I am opening a new administrative wing here in the Hartford office. I can bring you in at a respectable salary to handle the internal document flow, manage the compliance archives, and keep the back office organized." I stared at him. The room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. 4 years of advanced financial mathematics. 4 years of working graveyard shifts at the university library to cover the living expenses his modest support didn't reach. "You want me to be Julian's secretary," I said. "Don't use dramatic everyday language, Nate," Evelyn chimed in, her voice dripping with a soft, lethal maternal concern. "Your father is offering you a safety net. You've always been so fiercely stubborn, so solitary. Working under the family umbrella gives you a defined structure. It keeps you safe. It keeps me tucked away in a filing cabinet so Julian doesn't have to compete with his older brother, I replied, looking directly into Evelyn's pale blue eyes. My father's palms slapped the mahogany wood. The polite veneer vanished, exposing the absolute, unyielding tyrant beneath. You will not speak to my wife in that tone in this house. Let's get one thing straight, Nathaniel. The world does not reward raw, unguided effort. It rewards individuals who understand their placement. Julian is my primary focus. That is the reality of this family's inheritance structure. You are my son from another life, and that comes with certain operational boundaries. If you take this foolish crusade to Manhattan, you do it entirely off my balance sheet. He pointed a thick finger at my face. You walk out that door and I zero out your college fund residual. You get no graduation check. I will personally contact my network at the New York athletic clubs and the banking associations, and I will make it abundantly clear that you chose to sever ties with this family. You will not list the Sterling name as a professional reference. And when those Wall Street firms chew you up and spit you out onto the pavement, do not come crawling back to this property expecting me to pay your legal fees or finance your recovery. It was a surgical, clean amputation. He wasn't just cutting my allowance. He was promising to salt the earth ahead of me. I slowly stood up. I picked up my 3 folders and slid them back into my bag. My knees felt hollow, but my hands were completely steady. I accept the terms, I said. My father blinked, clearly expecting a negotiation, a plea, or an apology. Just remember this exact conversation, Dad, I continued, walking toward the heavy door. When the things I build overshadow everything you've ever claimed to own, don't you dare tell people you supported me. You forfeited the right to be my father the day you decided my mother's son was an inconvenience. I gripped the brass handle. A violent, cold tremor shot through my right hand, the physical manifestation of a boy's heart breaking for the very last time. I turned back and looked at the stranger sitting behind the desk. When I come back to Connecticut, you won't recognize me. And your opinion won't matter at all. I took the last train out of Hartford that night. I arrived at Grand Central Station with 2 duffel bags, $400 in cash, and a massive, unhealed wound. New York City does not welcome the wounded. It smells the blood and charges you rent for the privilege of bleeding. I took a room in Washington Heights, up on 181st Street. It was a cramped, 4th-floor walk-up that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage, industrial bleach, and old bodega pizza. I shared one tiny, mold-spotted bathroom with 4 other guys, 2 line cooks, a night shift paramedic, and a guy who claimed to be an independent currency trader but spent his days sleeping on the living room futon. My bedroom was a 9-by-7-foot concrete box with a single window that looked out at a brick alleyway. The 3 Wall Street offers I had proudly placed on my father's desk evaporated within 48 hours. True to his word, Charles Sterling had made his phone calls. When I followed up with the human resources directors at Goldman and Morgan, their tones were suddenly clipped, formal, and entirely finalized. We have decided to move forward with candidates whose background verifications present fewer internal complications. I took a job as a junior analyst at Horizon Partners, a bottom-tier, grindhouse investment boutique located above a noisy Irish pub in Midtown. My starting salary was so low that after taxes, the monthly subway pass and my share of the Washington Heights rent left me with exactly $42 a week for food. The real crisis hit in the first week of December. My roommate, the paramedic whose name was on the master lease, got a job in Seattle and moved out without 48 hours notice. He took the master security deposit with him, leaving the remaining 3 of us liable for a sudden $300 shortfall on the December rent. The landlord, a ruthless guy from Queens who wore a gold chain over a track jacket, stood in our narrow kitchen and tapped a baseball bat against the peeling linoleum. You boys got until Friday at noon, or I change the deadbolts and your junk goes out onto the fire escape. It was 12 degrees outside. I had $14 in my checking account. That night, while my remaining roommates argued in the hallway, I sat on my lumpy mattress and opened my canvas duffel bag. I reached into the very bottom, beneath my extra winter socks, and pulled out a small, faded blue velvet box. Inside was a 1972 vintage Omega Seamaster mechanical watch. It had a silver dial, a cracked leather strap, and a distinct, steady ticking sound. It was the only physical object that had belonged to my mother. She had bought it with her first paycheck as a high school music teacher, years before she ever met Charles Sterling. When Evelyn had cleared out my mother's old bedroom, I had stolen the watch out of a donation bin and kept it hidden in my shoes. I held the watch to my ear for a long time. I listened to the tiny gears moving, feeling the cold metal against my palm. The next morning at 7 a.m., I took the downtown local subway to a neon-lit pawn shop on 8th Avenue. The shop smelled of old brass, cheap cigar smoke, and desperate human decisions. The guy behind the thick bulletproof glass took the Omega, screwed a jeweler's loop into his eye, and popped the back casing open with a dirty thumbnail. "Movement's clean, but the strap is garbage," he grunted, tossing the piece onto a felt tray. "I can do 280. "I need 310, I said. My voice sounded thin, completely stripped of human dignity. "It's a genuine 10-20 caliber automatic." The pawnbroker looked up, his weary eyes scanning my cheap winter coat and my pale, hollow cheeks. He reached into a steel cash drawer, pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills and a 10, and slid them under the steel slot. "Sign the ledger, kid. You got 30 days to buy it back at $400 before it goes in the display case." I took the cash. I paid the landlord. For the next 6 weeks, I lived entirely on 99-cent packages of instant chicken ramen and tap water. I lost 14 pounds. My suits hung off my frame like sails on a ghost ship. On the 31st day, the exact afternoon my buyback window expired, I walked through a slushy January blizzard back to the 8th Avenue pawn shop. I didn't have the $400. I just wanted to stand on the sidewalk and look at the silver dial through the glass window one last time. The display case was empty. Panic, cold and sharp as a razor, hit the back of my throat. I pushed the heavy door open, setting off the rattling brass bell. The pawnbroker was sitting behind the counter, eating a pastrami sandwich. "The Omega Seamaster," I blurted out, gripping the edge of the transaction counter. "Where is it? I know I'm a day late. I just..." "Gone, kid," the guy mumbled around a mouthful of rye bread. "Sold it last night. Some private courier in a black Lincoln Town car came in, asked for the piece by the serial ledger number, and dropped 5 crisp Benjamins on the counter. Didn't even ask for a receipt." I stepped backward out into the biting winter wind. I stood on the slush-covered curb while yellow cabs splashed gray water against my shins. My mother was officially gone. Charles Sterling had taken my future, Evelyn had taken my home, and New York City had just swallowed my past. I thought that frozen sidewalk was the absolute bottom of my life. I was so incredibly wrong. The executive bullpen at Horizon Partners was an open-plan pasture designed specifically to monitor human misery. 40 cubicles sat under flickering, industrial fluorescent tubes that emitted a constant, high-pitched buzz that migrated directly into your molars. By my second winter in the city, I had become a functional piece of office furniture. I arrived every morning at 6:15 a.m. because the building's radiators kicked on at 6, and being at my desk early was the only way to get my fingers warm enough to type without making mechanical errors. I stayed until midnight because unfinished, highly volatile client portfolios had a miraculous habit of sliding onto my keyboard after the senior staff took the 5 p.m. commuter trains back to Westchester and Long Island. My direct manager was a man named Gregory Hayes. Gregory was 38, wore $3,000 Tom Ford suits that he bought on credit, and possessed an extraordinary, almost artistic talent for deflecting accountability while absorbing praise. He had been promoted 3 levels past his genuine intellectual capacity simply because he had a loud, booming laugh and played golf at the same New Jersey country clubs as the managing partners. Gregory developed a routine. He would stroll past my cubicle at 4:30 p.m. on a Friday, holding a leather briefcase in one hand and jingling his car keys in the other. He would drop a massive, unformatted spreadsheet onto my desk, offer a wide, predatory grin, and squeeze my trapezius muscle just hard enough to leave a bruise. "You're steady, Nate," Gregory would declare, his voice carrying across the quiet bullpen. "That's what I tell the partners. Sterling is a rock. We trust your reliability on these messy compliance cleanups." Trust, I learned very quickly, is an absolute corporate weapon when it is entirely disconnected from financial compensation or career advancement. It is the carrot they hang over the treadmill while they systematically increase the incline. I learned to keep my face completely neutral. I nodded mechanically, took the files, and let them believe I was just another docile, desperate kid who lacked the spine to resist. The project that finally cracked the foundation of my compliance arrived on a freezing Friday afternoon in February at exactly 4:47 p.m. It was the master logistics account for a massive, Chicago-based industrial real estate conglomerate. The client was a notorious, foul-mouthed septuagenarian named Frank Gannon, who had a documented history of firing investment firms via public, multimillion-dollar breach of contract lawsuits. A junior associate had completely botched the tax liability projections on a commercial real estate acquisition in the loop, creating an unmitigated $4 million tax exposure. If Gannon discovered the error before the Monday morning filing deadline, he would pull his entire pension fund portfolio out of Horizon Partners. The firm would instantly breach its liquidity covenants and miss the February payroll. Gregory Hayes stood in my cubicle, his face pale, smelling heavily of peppermint scotch and pure corporate panic. He dropped 3 separate 500-page binders onto my keyboard. "Gannon's lawyers are threatening a forensic audit on Monday morning." "Nate," Gregory whispered, his fingers twitching against his silk tie. "The senior partners are completely losing their minds. I need this real estate depreciation schedule completely rebuilt from the ground up by Sunday night. I can't touch it. I have my daughter's private equestrian finals in Greenwich this weekend." He looked at my faded off-the-rack shirt. "You fix this, Sterling, and I personally guarantee you're heading the senior analyst promotion list at the Q1 review. I'm putting my own reputation on the line for you here." I didn't argue. I packed my canvas duffel bag, took a yellow cab to LaGuardia, and caught a budget standby flight to Chicago. For the next 21 days, my life was reduced to a horrifying biological experiment. I lived out of a freezing, windowless conference room in Horizon's regional satellite office on Wacker Drive. Because the firm refused to authorize an expense account for a junior analyst, I couldn't afford a hotel. I slept on a cracked leather sofa in the break room for 3 hours a night. I kept 2 changes of cheap shirts in my duffel bag and showered at a $10 a month commercial gym 3 blocks away before the sun came up. By the 14th day, my central nervous system began to shut down. I developed a sharp, uncontrollable tremor in my left hand that appeared whenever I tried to hold a coffee pen. I lived on vending machine pretzels, black espresso, and adrenaline. I manually audited 3 years of complex subsidiary real estate filings, isolating the structural flaw in the parent company's debt consolidation. On the 18th day, Frank Gannon walked into the freezing conference room flanked by 3 corporate litigation lawyers wearing 3-piece charcoal suits. For 6 agonizing hours, I sat alone at the end of the long walnut table. I absorbed Gannon's screaming, his fist slams, and his personal insults while my manager, Gregory Hayes, sat in a heated tent in Connecticut watching horses jump over wooden fences. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer excuses. I deployed cold, unassailable financial math. I showed Gannon's legal team how my revised restructuring actually sheltered an additional $1.2 million in capital gains. When Frank Gannon finally picked up his Mont Blanc pen and signed the master portfolio renewal agreement, he didn't shake my hand. He just looked at my hollow, dark-circled eyes and grunted, "You're the only guy in this entire garbage outfit who checks his own edition, kid." The relief in the Horizon Manhattan headquarters the following Monday was physically palpable. You could feel the senior partners breathing again. On Thursday night, the firm hosted an extravagant celebratory dinner at an exclusive, 3-star steakhouse in the financial district. The private dining room was lined with vintage wine bottles. The tables were covered in thick white linen and heavy silver cutlery. I sat at the very far corner of the longest table, near the swinging kitchen doors. My suit jacket was draped over the back of my chair because the lining had torn at the armpit during my 3rd night on the Chicago break room sofa. My fingers were still stiff and bruised from thousands of hours of manual 10-key data entry. At the head of the table, Gregory Hayes stood up. He unbuttoned his pristine tailored jacket, raised a heavy crystal goblet of $200 Napa Valley Cabernet, and offered a brilliant, tear-dimmed smile to the managing directors. I just want to take a moment to honor the incredible dedication of our core management group, Gregory announced, his rich voice echoing off the mahogany paneling. When the Gannon real estate crisis hit our desks, we didn't blink. We deployed a unified, aggressive crisis management strategy. We spent weeks analyzing the Chicago liability structures, working around the clock to safeguard this firm's institutional reputation. To leadership, to vision, to horizon. 40 executives raised their glasses. To horizon, they echoed. I sat in my corner and slowly clapped my hands together. I watched the partners' deal distribution memo circulating down the table on a silver tray. When it reached my spot, I scanned the official deal credits. Lead Strategic Negotiator Gregory Hayes. Oversight and Compliance, Harrison Wells. Internal Audit Support, Horizon Back Office Pool. My name wasn't misspelled. It was completely, surgically non-existent. I didn't weep. I didn't flip the table or stand up and demand my rightful credit. That night, at 2:15 a.m., I sat on the peeling linoleum floor of my tiny apartment in Washington Heights. The radiator was clanking out its weak, metallic rhythm. I looked at my reflection in the dark, single pane of the alleyway window. I saw a man who looked 40 years old. Gray-skinned, hollow-eyed, a biological machine running purely on fumes and false hope. The ultimate revelation didn't arrive as a lightning bolt of poetic inspiration. It arrived as a heavy, cold slab of pure corporate exhaustion. They weren't testing my resilience to groom me for an executive chair. They weren't hardening my skills to prepare me for a Wall Street partnership. They were systematically utilizing me because I was reliable, because I absorbed massive institutional pressure without pushing back, and because they knew I lacked the powerful family connections that would force them to treat me with basic human caution. I thought of Charles Sterling sitting in his oak study. I thought of Evelyn's soft, plastic smile. The anatomy of the exploitation was identical. Merely a different room, a different set of suits, and a different tax bracket. 3 weeks after the steakhouse dinner, on a Friday afternoon at 4:55 p.m., I was packing my leather bag when Gregory Hayes strolled into my cubicle. He was wearing his cashmere overcoat, his cheeks rosy from the winter air. He dropped a massive 6-inch stack of raw compliance audits onto my keyboard. "Nate, my man," Gregory said, casually checking his reflection in my computer monitor. The SEC Compliance Division dropped a surprise inquiry on the Boston Real Estate Trust. I need these files entirely scrubbed and cross-referenced by 8 a.m. tomorrow. We got an emergency partner conference call. I stopped zipping my bag. I slowly turned around. I looked at the files. Then I looked at Gregory's left hand. He was casually tossing a heavy, black leather keychain bearing the golden crest of a brand new Porsche 911. The word left my mouth before my conscious brain even authorized the vocal cords to move. No, the word wasn't shouted. It was dropped into the cubicle like a cold lead weight. The entire junior analyst bullpen instantly froze. Typing ceased. Someone's telephone rang 3 times and went to voicemail because nobody dared to pick up the receiver. Gregory blinks. His wide, charming smile remained frozen on his mouth, but his eyes went small and hard. "I'm sorry, Nate. What did you just say?" His voice carried a strange, genuine confusion, as if an old piece of office machinery had suddenly started speaking to him in Aramaic. "I said no, Gregory," I replied. My voice was completely flat, completely devoid of human warmth, though my heart was hammering against my ribs at 110 beats per minute. "I have a prior personal commitment this weekend." Gregory stepped deeper into my cubicle, invading my physical space, his Tom Ford cologne suddenly turning sour. "Look, Sterling," he hissed, choosing his words with deliberate, quiet malice. "We all need to demonstrate a little operational flexibility to survive in this economic environment. I went to bat for you with the managing directors after the Chicago closing. You don't want to establish a reputation as an uncooperative variable. I picked up my bag and slung the strap over my shoulder. I stood up, utilizing my full 6'1" frame, forcing Gregory to take a fractional step backward into the aisle. I have demonstrated 2 years of unmitigated flexibility, Gregory, I said, looking right through his eyes. Today, I require absolute clarity. If this compliance scrub is an official addition to my defined role, I expect a formal adjustment to my compensation contract by Monday morning. Otherwise, the files remain on the keyboard. Enjoy your weekend. I walked down the narrow center aisle of the bullpen. I felt 40 pairs of eyes tracking my shoulder blades. The air behind me felt thin, charged with a terrifying electric wrongness. I didn't run. I took the slow elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the freezing Manhattan dusk. When I reached the 4th floor of my Washington Heights walk-up, the door was unlocked. My roommate Elena, a brilliant, fiercely cynical girl from Moscow who worked 70 hours a week as an immigration paralegal, was sitting on the kitchen counter eating cold leftover noodles out of a cardboard container. She pointed her plastic fork toward the small, wobbly laminate dining table. "Hey Nate, some guy wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my entire family's net worth came up the fire stairs an hour ago. Left a package for you. Said if I opened it, he'd personally see to it that my visa renewal got permanently lost in the federal processing archives." I walked over to the table. Resting in the center was a plain, heavy white cardboard box secured with a single strip of black linen tape. I pulled my pocket knife out and sliced the tape. I lifted the heavy lid. Resting inside on a bed of dark gray raw silk was a pristine, polished silver tin. I picked it up. My hands started to tremble. That same violent physiological spike I hadn't felt since the day I left my father's oak study. I popped the silver lid open. Resting on a round velvet pillow was my mother's 1972 vintage Omega Seamaster. The scratched crystal had been entirely replaced with flawless, unblemished sapphire. The rotted leather band was gone, replaced by a heavy, exquisite strap of matte black alligator skin. Resting directly over the watch crystal was a thick, cream-colored card made of heavy cotton vellum. It contained a single sentence, written in a sharp, commanding dark blue fountain ink. Your forensic isolation of the Chicago real estate debt was mathematically unassailable. Never sell your pedigree for $300 again. I stared at that handwriting until the gray alleyway outside turned completely black. The invisible war for my life had just begun. You do not run out of a burning building until you have meticulously mapped where the fire escapes lead. I didn't resign from Horizon Partners on Monday morning. That is what the old Nathaniel Sterling would have done. The impulsive, wounded kid who believed that dramatic exits created permanent solutions. Instead, I arrived at my cubicle at my usual 6:15 a.m., hung my coat over my chair, and began operating with the terrifying, absolute precision of a ghost inside a machine. They thought they were systematically draining my potential. They didn't realize I had entirely stopped pouring myself into their bucket. I spent the next 6 months isolating the genuine anatomy of leverage within the Manhattan financial district. I discovered that the real, unassailable power didn't reside in the loud, screaming trading floors or the flashy executive suites where men like Gregory Hayes showed off their sports car keychains. True power lived in the quiet, windowless compliance archives, in the unformatted digital footnotes of SEC regulatory filings, and in the unspoken, absolute terrors of the individuals sitting on corporate boards. My education was formalized by 2 extraordinary people who operated entirely outside the conventional corporate hierarchy. The first was Robert Vance, a brilliant, deeply eccentric senior risk actuary who sat in a glass corner office on the 39th floor, surrounded by 4-foot-tall towers of printed tax codes and half-eaten pastrami sandwiches. Robert taught me the applied physics of corporate debt. He showed me how to trace anonymous subsidiary cash flows through offshore shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. The second was Beatrice Vance. Beatrice was 62 years old, possessed a severe, chin-length silver bob, and held the title of managing partner at a specialized boutique firm that handled the quiet, out-of-court liquidations of distressed private equity funds. She was a woman who had spent 40 years surviving the most vicious, male-dominated boardrooms on Wall Street by cultivating a reputation for complete, unblinking clinical cruelty. Junior analysts actively took the service elevators just to avoid the risk of sharing an enclosed space with her. I deliberately sought her out. I found reasons to utilize the high-speed copy machines outside her corner suite. I made sure my physical frame was consistently visible within her peripheral vision without ever crossing the boundary into conversational intrusion. One evening at 8:15 p.m., while the rain was lashing against the glass tower, her voice cracked out of her open doorway like a dry whip. "You're the kid who caught the Gannon real estate exposure, aren't you?" I stopped. I turned and stepped into her minimalist office. There were no family photographs on her desk, no decorative plants. Just a dual-monitor setup and a heavy crystal tumbler half-filled with neat Macallan. "Yes, ma'am. Nathaniel Sterling," I said, keeping my posture entirely erect. Beatrice studied my cheap suit through her silver-rimmed reading glasses. 3 senior partners with 30 years of combined transactional experience reviewed that Chicago portfolio before it reached your cubicle, Nathaniel. None of them caught the cross-collateralization flaw you flagged. Why did you? I didn't offer a philosophical essay on corporate diligence. I gave her the only truth that held weight in her ecosystem. Because I didn't have the luxury of assuming they were right, ma'am, I replied, meeting her sharp, unyielding gaze. Most analysts assume correctness because verifying raw data requires personal risk and uncompensated hours. If I make an error, there is nobody in this building who will defend my position. I operate from a permanent deficit. Beatrice took a slow, measured sip of her scotch. A tiny, terrifying glimmer of clinical recognition appeared in her eyes. "Good," she said, offering one sharp nod. "Use that deficit. Money, Nathaniel, is merely the crude instrument used by individuals who lack access to critical information to keep score. Information is the ultimate currency. Accumulate it, Tam Lang. Never spend it until the market is completely trapped." Under Beatrice's severe, unofficial patronage, I stopped operating as an analyst and began operating as an intelligence asset. For months later, she secured my attendance at a private, entirely unpublicized gathering at a massive limestone monolith on the Upper East Side. There were no press passes at Eleanor Vance's townhouse, no social media check-ins. The 25 guests standing in the wood-paneled library included a prominent federal judge, 2 billionaire hedge fund managers, and Nathaniel Sterling, wearing a dark navy suit I had bought off the rack at a Midtown discount rack and paid an old Italian tailor in Queens $40 to recut to my exact physical measurements. Near the massive marble fireplace, a loud, supremely arrogant private equity titan named Harrison Wells was holding court. He was aggressively denouncing a complex new federal regulatory provision regarding inheritance tax shelters during corporate liquidations. He was speaking at 90 decibels, assuming his sheer net worth equated to absolute factual validity. He was completely structurally wrong. He was conflating 2 entirely separate subclauses of the Delaware Corporate Code. I stood near the tall library windows, holding a glass of plain seltzer. Beatrice Vance caught my eye from across the room. She didn't gesture. She merely tilted her chin a fraction of an inch toward the fireplace. I set my glass down on a silver coaster. I walked to the edge of the circle. "Excuse me, Mr. Wells," I said. My voice was so quiet, so completely restrained, that the entire circle had to lean forward fractionally to hear me. Harrison Wells paused mid-sentence, his face flushing a dark, offended crimson at the interruption. "And who the hell are you?" Wells barked, his eyes scanning my lack of an expensive lapel pin. "Nathaniel Sterling," I replied calmly. "You are misinterpreting subsection 4(b) of the revised statute. The tax shelter you are describing applies exclusively to wholly owned operational subsidiaries. Because the entity you are referencing holds secondary real estate liabilities through an unvested family trust, the debt automatically consolidates onto the acquirer's master balance sheet upon liquidation. If you execute the buyout using that formula, your investors will face an immediate 22% corporate capital gains penalty." The library went completely, definingly silent. You could hear the wood crackling in the hearth. Harrison Wells opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. I had cited the exact statute, exposed the structural failure of his financial architecture, and demonstrated the catastrophic bottom-line impact in fewer than 70 words. Beatrice Vance offered a tiny, affirming lift of her glass. "Thank you, Nathaniel. That historical context is critically vital." The conversation instantly pivoted away from Wells, abandoning him in his own exposed ignorance. Later, as I was standing in the marble foyer waiting for my thrifted wool coat, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a bespoke charcoal topcoat stepped out of the private smoking room. It was Alexander Thorne. He didn't offer polite flattery. He didn't ask where I went to school. He simply reached into his vest pocket, produced a thick, matte black card made of heavy metal, and slid it into my palm. "When you reach the operational stage where you are finally ready to stop making inherently stupid men look brilliant, call my direct wire," Thorne said. He stepped out into the Manhattan night before I could even read the embossed numbers. Back at Horizon Partners, Gregory Hayes finally realized his parasitic supply line was entirely severed. He initiated a textbook corporate whisper campaign. My name was methodically removed from key client correspondence. I was systematically uninvited from strategic valuation meetings. Gregory began dropping casual, deniable hints to the managing directors that Nate Sterling was struggling with internal emotional stability, that I was harboring a toxic attitude, and that my productivity had fallen off a cliff. Colleagues began stopping me by the break-room coffee machine to offer soft, pitying smiles and ask if everything was okay at home. I recognized the entire architecture of the manipulation. It was the exact same psychological isolation playbook Evelyn had deployed in my father's oak study 12 years ago to brand me as the family problem. This time, I didn't offer a defense. I didn't argue. I played the role of the overwhelmed, cooperative victim to absolute perfection. When Gregory cornered me by the copy room and ordered me to draft a massive, highly complex, 100-page analytical presentation for the firm's upcoming flagship real estate acquisition, I offered a meek, exhausted nod. "Of course, Gregory," I mumbled, looking at the floor. "I'll make sure the deal framework is completely ready for your partner presentation on Thursday." I spent 3 nights alone in my apartment building a masterpiece of strategic corporate finance. It was an unassailable acquisition model. But before I compiled the master presentation deck, I opened the raw digital source files. Utilizing a specialized cryptographic software I had acquired through Robert Vance's intelligence network, I embedded an invisible, permanent, time-stamped digital watermarking sequence directly into the master presentation's underlying XML source code. It recorded the exact author ID, the network terminal creation logs, and a hidden metadata signature locked to my personal employee identification number at 3:14 a.m. Gregory grabbed the printed presentation off my desk on Thursday morning without saying thank you. He slapped his own name onto the title slide, adjusted his silk tie, and strutted into the master boardroom like a conquering monarch. He had no earthly idea he was walking straight into a digital execution. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The trap was fully set, but before the blade dropped, the past reached out to claim its final tribute. The master boardroom at Horizon Partners on that Thursday morning smelled of stale espresso. Damp wool from the raincoats hung in the closet, and the distinct, quiet electricity of 40 ambitious men waiting to see who was going to get paid. The conference table was a massive slab of dark, polished walnut that stretched for 30 feet across the room. At the far end, dual high-definition projection screens illuminated the dim space with crisp, blue-tinted charts detailing the firm's proposed flagship real estate acquisition, a $400 million commercial portfolio centered in the Boston Technology Corridor. I sat at the very back of the room, squeezed onto a small wooden side chair reserved for the junior compliance pool. My lap held a plain legal pad and a single black ballpoint pen. At the head of the table, Gregory Hayes was putting on a masterclass in theatrical corporate ownership. He was wearing a brand new, bespoke charcoal suit that hugged his shoulders, a crisp spread collar shirt, and a heavy gold tie clip that caught the light every time he gestured toward the screen. He delivered the slide deck with effortless, booming charisma. He paced the head of the room, dropping his baritone voice into a confidential, highly persuasive register as he walked the managing directors through the cash flow projections, the tenant retention schedules, and the complex tax depreciation architecture. "What we have constructed here, gentlemen," Gregory announced, placing both palms flat on the polished walnut, "is a completely bulletproof acquisition vehicle. By restructuring the primary debt through a specialized series of pass-through entities in Delaware, we effectively insulate the master fund from any localized commercial real estate downturns while capturing an immediate 12% yield lift in year one. It's clean, it's aggressive, and it firmly establishes Horizon at the very top of the North Atlantic market." The managing partners nodded in unison. You could see the dollar signs reflecting in their reading glasses. Harrison Wells, sitting to the right of the senior chairman, offered a slow, appreciative tap of his Mont Blanc pen against his leather notepad. "Brilliant work, Hayes. Really top-tier strategic vision." Gregory offered a humble, perfectly calibrated dip of his chin. "Thank you, Harrison. I spent the last 3 weekends completely immersed in the Boston zoning archives to make sure our exposure was absolute zero." Then, from the middle of the table, senior partner Marcus Finch leaned forward. Marcus was 58, a former forensic tax litigator who rarely spoke during partner presentations unless he smelled blood in the water. He pushed his half-moon reading glasses down the bridge of his nose, looked at the printed appendix in front of him, and then looked up at Gregory. "Gregory," Finch said, his voice dry and rhythmic as a ticking clock, "turn the projection screen back to slide 42, the subsidiary debt consolidation framework." Gregory clicked the remote. The screen flickered, displaying a dense, highly intricate schematic of corporate boxes and intersecting fiscal arrows. "Walk me through the amortization schedule on the secondary mezzanine tranche," Finch instructed, leaning his chin on his folded hands. "Specifically, how are you bypassing the standard Massachusetts commercial transfer tax on the unvested property titles held under the third-tier shell company? Because looking at these raw figures, if that property title transfers prior to the completion of the commercial rezoning phase, the local tax authority is going to trigger an automatic reassessment penalty. That would wipe out $4 million of your projected year-one yield lift." Gregory froze. The wide, charming smile remained plastered on his face, but his eyes suddenly darted back and forth across the complex schematic like a trapped rodent looking for a hole in a baseboard. He cleared his throat, a wet, sticky sound that amplified through the room's overhead microphones. "Well, Marcus," Gregory began, his voice losing its rich, resonant bass and climbing into a thin, defensive tenor. "The underlying assumption there, based on standard market practice in the greater Boston sector, is that the commercial rezoning phase will be entirely grandfathered under the historical municipal development charter." "I don't give a damn about standard market practice, Hayes," Finch snapped, his open palm slapping the table. "I asked you a specific mechanical question about the tax amortization schedule on a $400 million real estate acquisition. If you personally spent the last 3 weekends immersed in the Boston archives as you just claimed, you should be able to recite the specific municipal exemption clause from memory. What is the statutory reference number?" The boardroom went completely dead. 40 executives watched Gregory Hayes begin to physically disassemble. A tiny bead of sweat broke out at his hairline, tracking slowly down his temple toward his perfectly trimmed sideburn. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, reached for his glass of ice water, and took a frantic gulp. "Marcus, I'd have to double-check the raw legal appendix in my office terminal to give you the exact statutory citation," Gregory stammered, his fingers twitching against the plastic presentation remote. "My compliance pool handled the secondary cross-referencing on the subsidiary footnotes." "Your compliance pool didn't write this presentation, Gregory." A calm, clinical voice rang out from the far end of the walnut table. Beatrice Vance stood up. She wasn't wearing a flashy designer suit. She was wearing a simple, severe black high-neck wool dress, her silver hair tucked behind her ears. She picked up her lightweight laptop, walked over to the primary master console at the head of the room, and plugged a single HDMI cable into the port. Allow me to provide the statutory reference number senior partner Finch is requesting, Beatrice said, her voice dropping like cold steel into the quiet air. Because I reviewed the underlying source code of this acquisition model at 6 o'clock this morning. She tapped 3 keys on her keyboard. The dual projection screens instantly wiped Gregory's colorful, polished presentation slides, replacing them with a stark, black and white digital diagnostic window. It displayed raw XML programming code, network server routing directories, and a glowing red digital verification box located at the very bottom of the screen. What you are looking at, gentlemen, Beatrice addressed the room, entirely ignoring Gregory's sweating face, is the embedded cryptographic metadata history of the master presentation deck Gregory Hayes just claimed as his own original strategic creation. If you look at the master authorship registry, you will see that this entire $400 million real estate architecture was conceived, drafted, and finalized by Employee Identification Number 884-09, Junior Compliance Analyst Nathaniel Sterling. The file was completed on Terminal 12 at exactly 3:14 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Gregory Hayes's sole technical contribution to this project was changing the author name on the title slide at 8:42 a.m. today. The collective intake of breath from 40 executives sounded like a sudden vacuum leak. Harrison Wells dropped his Montblanc pen onto the walnut table. It rolled off the edge and hit the carpet with a dull thud. Marcus Finch slowly turned his head, his cold, reptilian eyes locking onto Gregory's pale face. You brought a stolen analysis into a master partner valuation meeting, Hayes? Finch whispered, his voice shaking with profound, institutional rage. You put this firm's capital at risk based on numbers you don't even intellectually understand? Marcus? Wait, let me explain, Gregory gasped, holding both hands up like a man facing a firing squad. Sterling is under my direct departmental supervision. The standard employment contract clearly states that all work produced within the junior compliance pool is the sole intellectual property of the managing director. The employment contract protects the firm's proprietary assets. Gregory. Beatrice Vance cut him off, closing her laptop with a sharp, definitive snap. It does not protect an inherently incompetent manager who utilizes parasitic plagiarism to justify a $300,000 salary and a company car. The acquisition model Nathaniel Sterling built is mathematically pristine. The reason you couldn't answer Marcus's question about the transfer tax is because Nathaniel strategically placed the municipal tax exemption mechanics inside a locked, encrypted subdirectory that requires his personal employee password to execute. You presented a vehicle without knowing where the keys were. She turned her head and looked directly at my small chair in the back of the room. Mr. Sterling, Beatrice said calmly, do you possess the statutory exemption citation senior partner Finch requested? I slowly stood up. I didn't button my scuffed jacket. I didn't walk to the front of the room. I stood in my corner, looking across 30 feet of expensive suits, directly into Gregory Hayes's terrified, bloodshot eyes. Section 12C of the revised Suffolk County Municipal Development Code. Senior partner Finch, I said, my voice carrying with absolute, effortless clarity. The transfer reassessment penalty is entirely waived provided the acquirer assumes the primary construction liabilities through an established, localized non-profit educational trust prior to the closing date. I structured the third-tier shell company specifically as a vocational grant foundation. The tax exposure is zero. Marcus Finch stared at me for 3 long seconds. Then he wrote the citation down on his legal pad, drew a heavy, thick line through Gregory Hayes's name at the top of the valuation sheet, and looked at the managing chairman. The real estate acquisition model is approved, Finch announced, and I want Hayes's security access to the executive floor revoked before the markets close at 4 o'clock. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door of my tiny compliance cubicle slammed open. Gregory Hayes stood in the aisle, his bespoke tie ripped open at the collar, his face mottled with purple patches of hysterical, uncontrolled fury. He looked like a man who had just been thrown out of a moving vehicle. You think you're clever, you little bastard? Gregory hissed, his voice dropping into a ragged, trembling whisper as he leaned over my laminate partition. You think you can humiliate me in front of the managing directors and just walk away? You don't know who you're messing with, Sterling. You have no idea what the architecture of this firm actually looks like. I didn't look up from my computer monitor. I casually sorted a stack of blank legal pads. Your employment at Horizon Partners terminated 20 minutes ago, Gregory. I suggest you collect your personal belongings before building security escorts you to the street. Gregory let out a sharp, hysterical bark of laughter, slamming his fist onto the top of my cubicle partition. You think Marcus Finch runs this place? Gregory spat, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. You think Beatrice Vance is going to protect you? You're an idiot, Nate. You're a blind, solitary little boy playing in a room full of adults. I didn't get assigned to head your compliance pool by accident. I was specifically brought into this boutique 4 years ago by someone who wanted to make absolutely certain you never reached the executive tier. I stopped sorting my papers. My hands went still. I slowly turned my swivel chair around and looked at him. What did you just say? I asked. You heard me, Gregory sneered, his wide, charming, predatory smile returning in a grotesque, broken parody of its former glory. My mother's maiden name is Vance, Nate, but my grandmother's maiden name was Hayes. I'm Evelyn Sterling's second cousin from the Philadelphia branch of the family. She personally secured my junior associate placement here through the managing chairman's private country club network 4 months after your father threw you out of his house in Connecticut. She promised me an executive directorship and a clean piece of the Hartford commercial real estate expansion provided I kept you completely buried in the back-office compliance pool. She wanted you working 80 hours a week on garbage accounts, so you'd never have the professional prestige or the financial leverage to come back to Connecticut and challenge Julian's master inheritance trust. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. You think you won today? You just zeroed out your only family advocate in this entire city. Evelyn is going to make sure your father zero funds your grandmother's medical trust residual. You're going to die in this cubicle, Sterling. To understand the absolute, freezing stillness that just settled over my central nervous system, you have to realize what Gregory expected. He expected me to jump over the laminate desk and wrap my hands around his throat. He expected a dramatic, screaming confrontation, a breakdown, or a desperate plea for familial mercy. Instead, I felt an intense, profound, overwhelming lightness, the invisible, suffocating web of familial guilt, the lingering, pathetic hope that my father had merely been misled by circumstances, the lingering ache of rejection. It all completely, permanently evaporated into the dry office air. The root of my exploitation wasn't corporate greed. It was a cheap, domestic conspiracy. Charles Sterling hadn't just abandoned me. He had outsourced my professional suffocation to his wife's poor relatives to protect his golden child's balance sheet. I looked at Gregory Hayes. I didn't see a formidable corporate adversary. I saw a cheap, parasitic errand boy who had just outlived his utility. Thank you, Gregory, I said calmly. Gregory blinked, his hand freezing over my desk. What? I said thank you, I repeated, reaching for my desk telephone. You just confirmed that my historical balance sheet with Charles Sterling is officially zero. You have no further value to my operation. I lifted the receiver, dialed 3 numbers, and spoke into the mouthpiece. Security desk? This is Nathaniel Sterling in junior compliance. There is an unauthorized non-employee standing in aisle 4 exhibiting volatile behavioral distress. Please remove him from the premises immediately. I hung up the phone. Gregory opened his mouth to scream, but 2 massive, off-duty NYPD officers wearing Horizon security blazers appeared at the end of the aisle, grabbed him by both elbows, and frog-marched him backward toward the service elevators. That night at 9 p.m., I sat in the silent, empty bullpen. The overhead fluorescent lights were clicking off one by one as the building's automated master timer engaged. I pulled Alexander Thorne's heavy metal business card out of my wallet, picked up my cell phone, and dialed his direct wire. Thorne answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, deep, and entirely devoid of surprise. Nathaniel, Thorne said. Beatrice called me an hour ago. She said Hayes left the building in the back of a corporate security van. He did, I confirmed, looking out my small window at the glowing neon signs of Midtown. Are you finally ready to construct something real? Thorne asked. I thought about Charles Sterling sitting behind his mahogany desk. I thought about Evelyn adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. I thought about Julian wearing his velvet dinner jacket, believing the world was a carpet rolled out specifically for his feet. Yes, Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice resonating with cold, absolute certainty. I am ready. The transition from Horizon Partners to Thorne Capital did not happen through standard human resources channels. Alexander Thorne was a Leviathan who operated entirely on raw, strategic leverage. He didn't offer me a job as a senior analyst or a portfolio manager. What he offered me was an invisible, highly protected operational partnership structure inside his personal venture capital incubator. You possess an extraordinary, almost terrifying talent for spotting non-obvious structural flaws in complex financial architecture, Nathaniel, Thorne told me during our first private dinner at his limestone townhouse. You see the missing numbers because your family forced you to survive in the blind spots. I don't want you managing established, static wealth. I want you building brand new assets from the ground up. In exchange for your complete operational dedication and your diagnostic abilities, I will establish a specialized shadow fund inside Thorne Capital. You will receive complete autonomy, 40% equity on all originated deals, and the institutional protection of my master balance sheet. He leaned across the table, his silver hair catching the candlelight. There is only one non-negotiable operational condition: absolute, impenetrable discretion. You leave Horizon Partners with zero public drama. No internal grandstanding, no vindictive lawsuits against Hayes or your stepmother, no tell-all interviews in the business press. In my world, Nathaniel, the individuals who constantly talk about power are the ones who possess the least of it. True leverage is completely invisible until the exact moment the trap snaps shut. You let your family believe you are still a struggling, anonymous failure living in Washington Heights. You let them sleep in their comfortable illusions. And while they sleep, we systematically buy the ground underneath their beds. For the next 7 years, I entirely erased myself from the public financial registry. I moved out of Washington Heights into a completely private, highly secure penthouse loft located in an unlisted, converted industrial printing press in Tribeca. I changed my cell phone numbers, deleted my dead social media accounts, and stopped attending public banking mixers. If Nathaniel Sterling existed at all, he was merely an anonymous, unformatted digital footprint listed as an independent risk consultant in the quarterly subsidiary filings of Thorne Capital. While my brother Julian was attending lavish Ivy League fraternity formals and giving self-congratulatory interviews to Connecticut lifestyle magazines about his rigorous preparation to inherit the Sterling commercial empire, I was working 90-hour weeks in a pristine glass tower on Wacker Drive, quietly constructing an unassailable financial fortress. My definitive operational triumph arrived in my 4th year of quiet independence. Through Beatrice Vance's distressed asset network, I discovered an overlooked, highly volatile early-stage healthcare technology startup called Synapse Medical. The company had engineered a revolutionary, proprietary software platform designed to audit and eliminate massive institutional billing fraud inside large municipal hospital networks. The technology was brilliant, but the financial architecture was a complete disaster. The founder, Dr. Clara Higgins, was a brilliant, notoriously stubborn former pediatric neurosurgeon who had completely alienated standard venture capital firms by refusing to dilute her research equity or compromise patient privacy standards to accelerate short-term quarterly profits. Every conventional Wall Street risk metric suggested walking away entirely. The startup was burning $300,000 a month. They were facing an aggressive patent infringement lawsuit from a massive pharmaceutical conglomerate, and their primary pilot program with the Chicago Municipal Hospital System had just collapsed due to bureaucratic corruption. I spent 4 hours sitting on an overturned plastic milk crate in Clara Higgins's freezing, unheated research laboratory in South Boston. I listened to her talk about patient outcomes, about systemic data corruption, and about her absolute refusal to let corporate middle managers turn her medical life's work into a cheap billing algorithm. She possessed a fierce, unyielding, burning conviction that reminded me instantly of myself at 22. Desperate to prove an unblemished truth, entirely willing to burn her personal life down to the concrete to see her vision realized. I didn't offer her a standard venture capital term sheet. I offered her an alliance. The standard private equity firms want to buy your research and replace you with a compliant corporate CEO, Dr. Higgins, I told her, setting my legal pad on her crowded workbench. I don't want your chair. I want to build the moat around your laboratory. Thorn Capital will fund your primary operational burn rate for the next 36 months. We will absorb your legal defense costs against the pharmaceutical conglomerate, and we will utilize our municipal banking leverage to force the Chicago hospital system to reinstate your pilot program. In exchange, I want 51% voting control on all commercial distribution licensing and complete oversight of your master corporate balance sheet. Clara looked at my off-the-rack sweater and my scuffed Oxfords. And who the hell are you, Nathaniel? Alexander Thorne's errand boy. I am the man who checks the edition, Clara, I replied. And right now, your edition is leading straight to bankruptcy. Let me handle the wolves so you can finish the software. The next 4 years were an absolute, unmitigated masterclass in professional survival. The first 18 months were pure operational hell. Our lead software architect suffered a nervous breakdown and defected to a competitor. The FDA delayed our primary compliance certification for 9 agonizing months, and the pharmaceutical conglomerate deployed a multi-million-dollar legal scorched earth campaign designed specifically to drain our litigation reserves before we could reach trial. Twice, Alexander Thorne's internal risk committee formally recommended pulling our funding line and liquidating Synapse Medical for its raw patent scrap value. Both times, I formally invoked my executive veto as majority deal partner. I doubled down on my equity stake, personally financing Synapse's emergency payroll out of my accumulated venture capital residuals. I didn't sleep for 3 years. I lived on black espresso, cold conference room leftover catering, and absolute determination. In the fall of my 6th year at Thorn Capital, the software finally achieved master network integration across 40 municipal hospital systems in the Midwest. The financial results were not merely successful. They were completely disruptive. Synapse Medical didn't just audit hospital billing. It systematically exposed and recovered $1.8 billion in historical Medicare settlement fraud within 24 months. When we finally exited the vehicle via a specialized strategic merger with a massive global medical infrastructure conglomerate, we didn't achieve a standard venture capital return. We achieved a verified, fully realized multiple of 12 times our initial capital investment. The deal generated an immediate, verified net liquidity influx of $960 million directly onto Thorn Capital's primary balance sheet. My personal 40% deal equity residual was formally executed via an offshore wire transfer on a Tuesday afternoon. At age 33, Nathaniel Sterling, the boy who had been publicly branded a useless, directionless failure in his father's oak study, the kid who had lived on instant noodles and pawned his dead mother's mechanical watch to pay rent, was officially, fully documented by the Federal Banking Registry as a certified billionaire. The word felt utterly strange when my personal wealth manager first recited it across my marble kitchen island in Tribeca. Billionaire. It didn't make me feel taller. It didn't make my scuffed Oxfords look cleaner. Money, I realized in that quiet room, does not fundamentally change the substance of who you are. It merely removes the heavy, exhausting friction of everyday survival, exposing your genuine internal architecture to the light. 2 months later, Alexander Thorne formally requested my presence in his private rooftop conservatory overlooking Central Park. Thorne was 71 now. His silver hair was entirely white, and he walked with a slight, elegant limp from an old hip injury, but his eyes retained the terrifying, unblinking clarity of a top-tier predator. He sat in a wicker armchair, holding a glass of iced tea, and looked across the concrete canopy of Manhattan. I have spent 45 years constructing this firm, Nathaniel, Thorne said quietly. I have survived 6 major market corrections, for federal regulatory overhauls, and 2 corporate coup attempts by my own managing partners. But I have never met an individual who possessed your absolute, terrifying capacity for strategic patience. You stood behind the curtain for 7 years. You originated billions in institutional value, and you never once asked to see your name printed in the annual press releases. He reached onto the glass table, picked up a thick, leather-bound legal folio, and slid it across the table. I am formally stepping down as Chief Executive Officer of Thorn Capital at the end of the fourth quarter, Thorn announced. I have executed a binding master ownership transfer agreement. I am retaining a 49% passive minority equity stake for my family foundation. The remaining 51% voting control, the master managing directorship, and the permanent chairmanship of Thorn Capital are officially transferred to Nathaniel Sterling. The firm is yours. I looked at the legal document. I looked at the signature lines. Mr. Thorn, this is your entire life's legacy, I said, my voice quiet against the hum of the city below. Thorn offered a slow, profound smile. It is my legacy, Nathaniel. And that is precisely why I am giving it to the only man I trust not to let inherently stupid people turn it into scrap metal. You own the ocean now. It's time to stop swimming in the dark. The invitation to Charles Sterling's annual Christmas Gala arrived 3 weeks later on a freezing Tuesday morning in early December. It had been forwarded through so many thick layers of corporate intermediaries, blind trusts, and legal holding companies that it took my executive secretarial pool 3 days to trace its origin back to the primary administrative wing of Sterling Enterprises in Hartford. It was a lavish, heavy cardstock invitation featuring embossed gold cursive lettering and a delicate holly border. Charles and Evelyn Sterling cordially request the honor of your presence at the annual Sterling Enterprises Holiday Triumph and Family Convergence. Listed directly beneath my father's name, printed in bold, prominent lettering as the official guest of honor, was Alexander Thorn, managing chairman of Thorn Capital. Alexander called my private terminal 5 minutes after the physical invitation landed on my desk. Charles sent this to my personal residential wire. Thorn chuckled, the sound dry as winter leaves. He has no intellectual conception of our actual relationship. His primary commercial real estate expansion in the Hartford sector has completely breached its liquidity reserves. Nathaniel. His occupancy rates dropped 30% in Q3, and his lead regional banking syndicate refused to renew his short-term construction notes. He's facing technical insolvency by January 1st. He believes I'm coming to his Christmas party to authorize an emergency mezzanine rescue note to save his family legacy. I walked over to the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window of my office on the 42nd floor. Outside, a soft, indifferent December snow had begun to fall over the concrete canyons of Midtown, dusting the tops of the yellow cabs below with a fine coat of white. I thought about the 22-year-old boy who had stood in that dark oak study, clutching his Wall Street folders while his father promised to destroy his career. I thought about Evelyn adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet, making sure everyone knew I was an unwanted problem. I thought about Julian wearing his velvet dinner jacket, shielded from every drop of human struggle. Are you going to accept the invitation, Alexander? I asked. That depends entirely on my chief executive officer, Thorn replied calmly. What is your strategic directive, Nathaniel? I watched my scuffed Oxfords reflecting in the reinforced glass. We are going to Connecticut, I said, a profound, absolute sense of cold, pristine finality settling over my shoulders. Not for retribution, not for theatrical vindication, but because some narratives demand a definitive ending. And this one has been left open for far too long. Which brings us completely full circle, back to the grand hall of the Hartford Club on that freezing Saturday night before Christmas. Outside, the Connecticut blizzard was howling against the 15-foot arched windows, rattling the leaded glass with sudden violent gusts of winter wind. Inside, the ballroom was a masterclass in carefully curated, entrenched social insulation. 200 members of the regional corporate elite stood in tight, polite clusters under the blazing crystal chandeliers, sipping vintage champagne and exchanging false, breathless flatteries about their respective real estate portfolios and prep school board memberships. I stood near the tall Christmas tree, exactly where my memory preserved me. I was wearing my old, faded black wool coat, its hem slightly frayed from years of rubbing against New York subway seats, and my scuffed dark Oxfords. My companion for the evening was Dr. Clara Higgins. Clara wasn't wearing a sequined designer gown. She was wearing a stunning, perfectly tailored midnight blue velvet dinner suit that she had commissioned from a master tailor in London, her dark hair pinned back with a single silver comb. We had entered the ballroom together through the side brass doors, generating an immediate, quiet, inevitable ripple of profound social disorientation among the older guests. My father, Charles Sterling, spotted me almost instantly from his position near the master champagne fountain. He was 64 now, and though his silver hair was still meticulously parted and his bespoke dinner jacket looked immaculate from a distance, the heavy, sagging skin around his jaw and the yellowish bags under his eyes exposed the immense, unacknowledged physical toll of his impending financial collapse. When he saw me standing by the tree, his gracious, political host persona completely evaporated. His face cycled rapidly through sheer surprise, sharp irritation, and finally, a flicker of genuine, naked social panic. He surged across the patterned carpet toward me, leaving the state senator standing alone by the ice sculpture. "Nathaniel," my father said, his voice dropping into a tight, furious baritone hiss as he stopped 3 feet away. "What in God's name are you doing here? Who authorized your clearance at the security desk downstairs?" "You sent me an invitation, Dad," I replied calmly, keeping my hands resting in my coat pockets. My father blinked, his mind frantically recalibrating his social script. "The master mailing list is generated automatically by my compliance pool from historical tax registries. You haven't attended a family function in 12 years. Nathaniel, you have no business being in this room tonight. This is a highly sensitive executive gathering." He glanced nervously at Clara, his eyes scanning her bespoke velvet suit, visibly struggling to place her within his established Connecticut social hierarchy. "And who is your companion?" my father asked, his tone dripping with a heavy, patronizing skepticism. "Another one of your immigrant roommates from Washington Heights?" "Dr. Clara Higgins." Clara introduced herself, offering a brief, frigid nod that carried the unyielding authority of a top-tier neurosurgeon. "Chief Technology Officer of Synapse Medical Systems." The mention of an established corporate title caused my father's eyebrows to twitch fractionally, but his innate, overwhelming arrogance instantly overrode his basic business caution. He smoothed his silk tie, his posture stiffening. "Well, Dr. Higgins," my father said, offering a tight, plastic smile, "I'm sure whatever modest technical venture you and Nathaniel are attempting in Manhattan is very educational. But tonight's gala is centered around institutional capital. Alexander Thorne of Thorne Capital is arriving at any moment to deliver the keynote address and review the primary underwriting notes for the Sterling commercial expansion." He turned his head back toward me, his pale eyes narrowing into a cold, familiar glare. "Julian mentioned you'd achieved some minor supervisory position in a midtown back-office compliance pool." "Nathaniel," my father hissed, "a respectable desk job. I'm glad you finally learned to accept your operational placement, but I will not have you hovering around the executive tables trying to network with my lead underwriters. Grab a plate from the buffet, sit at the overflow tables near the coat check, and do not make a spectacle of yourself." My brother Julian materialized beside him, smelling heavily of Tom Ford cologne and peppermint schnapps. He looked at my scuffed Oxfords and let out a short, dismissive snort. "Jesus, Nate," Julian muttered, adjusting his bespoke velvet dinner jacket. "Did you walk here from Grand Central? You look like a damn vagrant. Evelyn's hosting the Regional Prep School Board at Table 1. Don't embarrass me in front of the chairman. These people are above you." My stepmother Evelyn stood 3 feet behind Julian, her face a mask of smooth, paralyzed perfection. She didn't offer a greeting. She performed her signature physical gesture, a small, exquisite, highly deliberate adjustment of her diamond tennis bracelet, communicating to the surrounding elite that she recognized the social stain I represented and had chosen to remain entirely untouched by it. Around us, the polite conversations faltered. Several prominent guests stopped talking entirely, turning their heads to watch the Sterling family's discarded son receive his customary public dressing down. I saw the quiet, profound satisfaction in their eyes, the historical certainty that Charles Sterling's firstborn was, and always would be, an irrelevant failure. Then, the massive brass doors at the east end of the grand hall swung wide open. Alexander Thorne stepped into the ballroom. He was wearing a magnificent, ankle-length charcoal overcoat lined with dark mink, his silver-headed walking cane striking the hardwood floor with a sharp, metallic rhythm that instantly silenced the entire room. Two Thorne Capital managing directors followed him like silent, charcoal-suited shadows. The atmosphere in the Hartford Club instantly underwent a violent, molecular reconfiguration. My father's face went completely flush. The arrogant, controlling patriarch vanished, replaced by a sweating, desperate, pathetic sycophant. Charles practically shoved Julian out of the way, surging forward across the carpet with both hands extended. His chest puffed out in a grotesque parody of executive equality. "Alexander!" my father boomed, his voice echoing off the oil paintings. "Welcome to the Hartford Club, an absolute institutional triumph of an evening you've graced with your presence. I have table 1 entirely reserved for your delegation right next to the state senator. I'd love to get you a glass of vintage Dom Perignon and walk you through the Q4 revenue recovery schedules for our primary commercial real estate trust." Alexander Thorne didn't take my father's extended hand. He didn't even break his stride. He looked qua vi Charles Sterling with the unhurried, terrifying indifference of an ocean liner bypassing a piece of floating driftwood. Thorne walked directly through the physical space my father was desperately trying to claim, tracking across 15 feet of patterned carpet, and stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The ambient noise in the ballroom completely choked. You could hear the snow lashing against the arched glass windows. Thorne unbuttoned his mink-lined topcoat, handed his silver cane to Clara Higgins with a warm, gallant nod, and then looked at me. "Nathaniel," Thorne said, his rich voice resonating through the overhead microphones and echoing off the oak paneling. "You're late." The Rolls-Royce was idling downstairs in the slush for 20 minutes. "Dr. Higgins, I trust my chief executive officer hasn't been boring you with SEC compliance footnotes during the drive." "He was exceptionally well-behaved, Alexander," Clara replied smoothly, sliding her arm through mine. My father materialized at Thorne's left elbow, his social radar spinning into complete, frantic terminal system failure. His mouth opened, but no words emerged. He looked at Alexander Thorne, then looked at my scuffed dark Oxfords, then looked at Julian's gaping face. "Alexander," my father stammered, his baritone voice cracking violently, the false political lightness completely shattering. "I don't understand. You two know each other." Alexander Thorne slowly turned his head. He looked down his aristocratic nose at Charles Sterling, his eyes narrowing into a cold, unblinking display of pure, top-tier corporate disbelief. "Know him?" Thorne repeated, the 2 words dropping like heavy lead weights into the freezing air. "Charles, aren't you going to introduce me to your boss?" The ballroom went perfectly, definingly still. Nobody moved. A waiter holding a silver tray of champagne glasses froze mid-step near the buffet. "My boss?" my father whispered hoarsely, the blood draining entirely from his face, leaving his skin the color of curdled milk. "Alexander, please. This is an inappropriate time for a joke. Nathaniel is my discarded son. He's a junior compliance clerk living in some tiny apartment in Washington Heights." "Nathaniel Sterling hasn't lived in Washington Heights for 7 years, Charles," Thorne interrupted, his voice ringing with absolute, crushing institutional authority. "And he is not a compliance clerk. It has been 3 years since I formally transferred my majority voting control. I assumed your legal compliance pool informed you. Nathaniel is the permanent managing chairman, lead deal partner, and majority 51% owner of Thorne Capital." My father let out a strangled, desperate, choking gasp, his hand flying to his throat as if he were physically suffocating. He stumbled backward half a step, bumping into Julian. "That That is structurally impossible, my father gurgled, his eyes bulging as he pointed a shaking finger at my plain wool coat. Thorn Capital manages $4 billion in institutional assets. How could a boy who left my house with $400 and zero family connections possibly afford to purchase majority voting control of a Wall Street leviathan? He didn't purchase it with family connections, Charles. Dr. Clara Higgins spoke up, her voice crisp and surgical as a scalpel. He purchased it with verified performance. 4 years ago, Nathaniel originated, structured, and led Thorn Capital's primary venture investment in Synapse Medical Systems. When we executed our master corporate merger last fall, the transaction generated $900 across your primary banking syndicate. Nathaniel's personal equity residual on that single deal was larger than the master valuation of Sterling Enterprises' entire historical commercial real estate portfolio. Around us, the collective shock of 200 elite guests mutated into sheer, unadulterated social panic. I heard the frantic, rapid tapping of fingers against glass smartphone screens as several younger hedge fund managers in the crowd immediately accessed the federal corporate registry. Jesus Christ, she's telling the truth. A prominent corporate banking attorney at table 2 blurted out, pure, unshielded astonishment ringing in his tone. Look at the SEC Master Ownership Directory. Nathaniel Sterling, Chief Executive Officer and primary shareholder of Thorn Capital. According to the updated Forbes profile published last month, his verified personal net worth is currently valued at $1.4 billion. $1.4 billion. The recitation of that number hung in the quiet air of the Hartford Club like an absolute, unappealable death sentence. I looked at my brother Julian. His pale, handsome face was completely slack, his jaw hanging open, his expensive velvet dinner jacket suddenly looking like a cheap, ridiculous Halloween costume. I looked at my stepmother Evelyn. Her smooth, paralyzed social mask had completely shattered, exposing the raw, ugly, terrified gray reality underneath. Her fingers were clawing frantically at her diamond tennis bracelet, the physical anchor of her false superiority completely severed. I looked directly into the eyes of Charles Sterling, the man who had demanded I not return to Connecticut until I was someone of consequence, the man who had casually branded me a homeless failure in front of 200 people, the man who had spent 12 years systematically erasing my mother's memory from his family narrative because I was an inconvenient variable. Alexander Thorn is listed on your gala invitations as the official guest of honor tonight. Dad? I said quietly, ensuring every single frozen face in the ballroom could hear my steady voice. He is attending this dinner because I personally instructed him to be here, because I decided it was finally time my family met the man who bet his entire institutional balance sheet on my intelligence when you chose to zero-fund my existence. My father's knees buckled fractionally. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the ice sculpture to keep from physically collapsing onto the patterned carpet, his fingers slipping against the melting frost. You built Thorn Capital? My father whispered hoarsely, his pale eyes completely hollowed out by sheer, catastrophic realization. You were standing behind Thorn this entire time? You own the master fund. Alexander Thorn took half a step forward, towering over my father's shrunken frame. Let's get one thing completely clear regarding your commercial real estate expansion, Charles, Thorn said coldly. The regional banking syndicate didn't refuse to renew your short-term construction notes due to market conditions. They refused because Thorn Capital formally acquired your lead underwriting bank in Q2. The Thorn Sterling Master Mezzanine Fund currently holds 100% of your unvested commercial mortgages. And the Sterling listed on that master debt registry is standing right in front of you. Nathaniel doesn't just own my firm, Charles. He personally owns the ground underneath your primary Hartford office building. If he executes his master foreclosure rights on January 1st, your entire family legacy becomes a wholly owned subsidiary of his back-office compliance pool. The profound, suffocating silence that followed was the exact moment the historical balance of power in my family permanently inverted. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The formal holiday dinner portion of the gala proceeded with the horrifying, mechanical awkwardness of an untelevised state funeral. The managing staff of the Hartford Club methodically served courses of roasted tenderloin and winter truffle risotto, but nobody ate. Silver cutlery scraped weakly against fine porcelain in a room entirely paralyzed by absolute social shock. Every single conversation at the 10 executive tables, regardless of its starting topic, inevitably gravitated toward my side of the room. 200 members of the Connecticut corporate elite stared at my scuffed dark Oxfords with sudden, profound reverence, their eyes tracking my physical movements with the desperate, calculating intensity of survivalists watching a weather radar. At 9:30 p.m., the master of ceremonies formally announced the holiday toast. This was the traditional highlight of the evening, the designated moment where Charles Sterling customarily took the stage to deliver a lengthy, self-congratulatory baritone speech detailing his firm's regional triumphs, celebrating Julian's inevitable ascension to executive leadership, and thanking his banking partners for their unyielding loyalty. My father slowly walked up the 3 wooden steps to the temporary staging area. He looked like a man walking to his own hanging. His posture was completely bent, his silver hair slightly disheveled from his sweating forehead. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned yellow, and leaned into the gooseneck microphone. "Good evening, distinguished guests," my father began. His voice, historically a rich, commanding, resonant instrument of pure corporate authority, was entirely gone. It emerged as a thin, reedy, trembling croak that fed back weakly through the overhead speakers. "Thank you for joining Sterling Enterprises tonight as we celebrate the past year's commercial milestones." He paused. It was a long, excruciating, 15-second gap of complete mental paralysis. He stared down at his printed index cards, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled against the microphone stem. "It is also a distinct honor," my father managed, his watery eyes scanning the dim room and locking onto my table, "to celebrate the complete reunification of our family structure. I am extraordinarily proud to officially welcome my eldest son, Nathaniel, Chief Executive Officer of Thorn Capital, back to the Hartford Club." The profound lie of that word, proud, resonated through the grand hall like a cracked church bell. Nobody applauded. From table 2, senior banking editor Arthur Pendleton of the New England Financial Journal slowly stood up. He didn't wait for the formal Q&A session. He held a digital voice recorder in his hand and looked directly up at the podium. "Charles, if you'll excuse the direct journalistic inquiry," Pendleton said loudly, completely overriding the polite etiquette of the room. "Is the federal regulatory filing correct? Does your discarded firstborn son hold majority voting control over the primary institutional debt fund currently underwriting Sterling Enterprises' commercial expansion? And were you completely ignorant of his professional identity until 20 minutes ago?" My father's jaw twitched. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward Evelyn for rescue, but she was staring blankly at her half-empty wine glass, completely undone. Our family experienced a brief period of internal operational distance due to competing geographical priorities. My father stammered, his voice cracking into a desperate whine. "We lost touch over the years while Nathaniel was pursuing independent ventures in Manhattan." "You lost touch," Pendleton repeated the phrase, turning it over in the quiet room like a cheap, rotted piece of wood. "Charles, you personally told the regional banking syndicate last year that your eldest son was an emotionally unstable compliance risk who refused to follow your management program. You told your lead investors he was entirely unremarkable. And now the verified SEC ownership directory shows he could purchase your entire commercial real estate trust with his annual subsidiary dividend. How does a corporate chairman remain entirely blind to the existence of a billionaire inside his own immediate bloodline?" The question was professionally, conclusively fatal. It didn't just expose my father's domestic cruelty. It systematically dismantled his foundational reputation as a competent, detail-oriented corporate manager. My father offered no response. He let out a weak, strangled wheeze, folded his index cards, and shuffled awkwardly off the stage without delivering the holiday toast. The applause from Table 1 was polite, immediate, and noticeably, definingly muted. The real, unrecoverable destruction of Charles Sterling occurred during the post-dinner cocktail hour. I stood near the tall, arched windows with Clara Higgins, holding a plain seltzer, quietly observing my father's frantic, desperate attempts to network across the room. It was a total, unmitigated operational failure. Managing directors who had spent decades playing golf at his country clubs now methodically turned their backs when he approached the bar. Conversations that should have revolved around his Q4 development milestones kept inevitably circling back to pointed, highly humiliating questions about me. Charles, did you possess advance insight into Thorn Capital's massive healthcare tech exit last fall? Charles, have you reviewed the stunning analytical profile published in Fortune regarding your son's non-obvious debt structuring? Charles, do you realize your son's personal liquid reserves currently exceed the municipal budget of Hartford County? Each casual inquiry was another precise, microscopic turn of the institutional knife. They didn't care about his fragile ego anymore. They were actively auditioning for my capital. At 10:45 p.m., my brother Julian finally approached me near the grand foyer doors. He looked entirely stripped of his historical polish. His bespoke velvet dinner jacket was unbuttoned. His silk bow tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar, and his eyes were red-rimmed and completely exhausted. He possessed the profound, crushing weariness of a young man whose fundamental, lifelong conception of the universe had just been permanently liquidated. "How long, Nate?" Julian asked, his voice dropping into a ragged, barely audible whisper as he stopped 2 feet away. "How long have you been standing behind Thorn? How long have you owned the primary debt notes?" 7 years on the venture origination side, Julian, I replied calmly. 3 years as lead majority shareholder. Julian slowly shook his head, his fingers twitching against his empty glass. "And you deliberately never called us. You never dropped a single hint. You let Dad run around the state bragging about his commercial real estate expansion while you were quietly purchasing the lead mortgages underneath his feet. Why did you do it, Nate? Pure, theatrical retribution? You wanted to publicly destroy his institutional standing at his own Christmas gala." I looked at him. I didn't feel a single drop of fraternal triumph. If my primary operational motivation were retribution, Julian, I would have executed this framework 5 years ago, I said calmly. I would have granted every public interview to Wall Street magazines, personally leaked the corporate debt consolidation records to the Connecticut press, and made absolutely certain the entire North Atlantic market knew that Charles Sterling's discarded son was underwriting his master balance sheet. I didn't come here tonight for retribution. Then why choose this exact moment? Julian pleaded, his pale eyes welling with sudden, unshielded tears. Why come back tonight? Because I am finally, definitively done, I said, looking across the dim grand foyer at the elegant remnants of my father's shattered triumph. For 12 years, Julian, I carried the enormous, suffocating weight of what transpired in Dad's oak study, the dismissive words, the systematic erasure of my mother's memory, the absolute, constant ache of being treated like a domestic liability in my own family structure. Tonight, I am actively setting that burden down on the carpet. Not because you or Dad offered an apology. Not because anything has fundamentally changed between us. But because I am completely exhausted from granting this family the definitive power to wound me by your absence. Julian flinched violently. A tiny, involuntary physical spasm that confirmed I had struck a completely unshielded nerve. Nate, I didn't know what Dad actually said to you that day in the study. I swear to God I thought. You were standing right outside the door, Julian. I interrupted him, my voice flat and entirely finalized. You specifically told me not to embarrass you. You chose to make your own life comfortable by Hua Theo, the prevailing domestic script. You enjoyed the complete warmth of the family umbrella because you let them use my bones for the primary tent poles. I left him standing alone by the marble columns, his entire physical posture communicating absolute defeat, and walked toward the master coat check. As Thomas, my veteran driver, was helping me into my faded wool overcoat, my father intercepted me near the heavy brass front doors. Charles Sterling had visibly aged 10 years in the 3 hours since my confident arrival. The smooth, controlling baritone host was entirely gone, replaced by an old, shrunken, physically diminished man whose lifelong corporate architecture was completely in ruins. "Nathaniel, wait," my father whispered, spreading both trembling hands in a pathetic gesture of absolute helplessness. "Please, don't leave the premises like this. We need to schedule an executive session. I have no earthly idea what I can say to you. Everything I steadfastly believed about your professional capacity, I was completely, fundamentally wrong." "You were, Dad?" I agreed simply, adjusting my scuffed lapel. "If I had only known the underlying truth about your financial position," my father pleaded, tears finally spilling over his wrinkled eyelids and tracking down his cheeks. I would have brought you into the primary master trust. I would have called you on your birthdays, included you in the master family convergence." "I know you would have, Dad," I said quietly, looking directly through his pale, weeping eyes. "And that is precisely the part that inflicts the deepest wound. Not the fact that you threw me out into the concrete 12 years ago, but the absolute, documented certainty that your basic human decency was entirely conditional on my net worth." Alexander Thorne appeared at my elbow, his mink-lined coat buttoned, his silver cane ready. "The Phantom is warmed up, Chief Executive Officer." I looked at Charles Sterling one last time. "I was always someone of historical consequence, Dad," I stated, my voice ringing firm, cold, and completely unassailable in the freezing foyer. "You simply lacked the strategic vision to see it." I turned my back on him, pushed the heavy brass doors open, and stepped out into the howling Connecticut blizzard, leaving Charles Sterling standing completely alone among the elegant, glittering ruins of his own devastating lifelong assumption. The morning immediately following the Hartford Gala, I woke up in my master bedroom in Tribeca with a peculiar, entirely unprecedented biological sensation in my chest. It wasn't the fiery, adrenaline-fueled rush of executive triumph. It wasn't the bitter, metallic taste of fully realized retribution. It was something extraordinarily quieter, deeper, and infinitely more powerful. Felt exactly like absolute peace. My private secure terminal had accumulated 47 urgent voicemails overnight. Frantic regional bankers, prep school chairmen, and managing partners from Connecticut all desperately attempting to verify my personal cell phone number. I didn't listen to a single recording. Utilizing my master administrative clearance, I formally executed a global block on the entire Hartford area code, wiped the terminal logs clean, and walked over to my marble kitchen island to brew a strong black espresso. I stood by my floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass window, silently watching the pale winter sun break across the jagged concrete canopy of lower Manhattan. Below, the streets were filling with thousands of anonymous commuters, all bundled in heavy winter coats, hoi-ha stepping through the slush toward the subway grates, entirely consumed by their own private, silent struggles. I held my coffee cup with my left hand. My fingers were completely steady. The minor physiological tremor that had plagued my nervous system since my days on the Chicago breakroom sofa was entirely, permanently gone. I pulled my left sleeve back fractionally. Ticking steadily against my wrist crystal was my mother's 1972 vintage Omega Seamaster. Looking down at that silver dial, I finally understood the genuine, fundamental mechanics of my 34 years on this earth. The raw, violent anger that had consumed me at 22 had been an absolutely essential fuel. The aggressive, solitary drive for professional survival inside Horizon Partners had been completely necessary to keep me from starving onto the pavement. But the lingering, exhausting, pathetic human need to prove my personal worth to Charles and Evelyn Sterling had finally, irreversibly run its operational course. My family knew the absolute truth now. But historical knowledge itself did not possess the magical, transformative capacity to rebuild a rotted domestic foundation. Enormous institutional success could not retroactively generate a mother's missing warmth or erase 12 years of deliberate emotional exile. What could change, I realized in that luminous room, was simply my internal placement. I could actively choose to entirely drop the heavy yardstick of their monumental failures of human imagination. I could finally accept that some familial balance sheets were structurally defaulted beyond any meaningful legal or emotional restructuring, and that profound, absolute acceptance was not synonymous with personal defeat. It was absolute liberation. At exactly 7:15 a.m., the secure lobby intercom chimed. My private concierge spoke through the speaker console. "Mr. Sterling? Your brother Julian is standing in the master vestibule downstairs. He does not possess terminal clearance, but he is exhibiting severe emotional fatigue. Shall I contact NYPD building security?" "No," I said, setting my espresso cup down on the marble. "Authorize elevator access to the penthouse terminal." 2 minutes later, the private pneumatic elevator doors slid open with a soft hiss. Julian stepped into my foyer. He looked completely destroyed. He hadn't shaved. His jaw was covered in dark, patchy stubble. His eyes were violently red-rimmed from a complete lack of sleep, and he was still wearing the identical, crumpled white spread-collar shirt and dark trousers from the gala the night before. His bespoke cashmere overcoat hung heavily over his forearm. He stopped at the edge of the patterned runner carpet, looking around the massive, open-plan architectural loft, his eyes taking in the floating steel staircases, the original contemporary oil canvases, and the sheer, unblinking scale of my private existence. "Jesus Christ, Nate," Julian whispered, his voice thin, dry, and completely hollowed out. "This place, it's magnificent." "What do you require, Julian?" I asked, standing by the kitchen island, keeping my physical posture entirely relaxed. Julian dropped his cashmere overcoat onto a side bench. He didn't walk toward me. He sank slowly onto the bottom wooden step of the floating steel staircase, buried his face in both hands, and let out a long, ragged, trembling sob that echoed off the industrial brickwork. "I couldn't sleep a single second last night, Nate," Julian wept, his shoulders heaving violently beneath his wrinkled shirt. "I sat in the dark in my condominium in Hartford, and I kept hearing your voice in the foyer. I kept thinking about what you said about how I chose to make my own life comfortable, how I let Dad use your bones for my tent poles, and you were completely, structurally right." He lifted his wet, bloodshot eyes, looking at me across 30 feet of polished concrete. "I failed you, Nate. Not just that afternoon outside Dad's study when I was 16, but every single day thereafter. When I was at Ivy League formals, when I was driving the sports cars Dad bought me, I knew you were down here in the city working yourself to death. I knew it was morally, fundamentally wrong, and I never once picked up the telephone to ask if you had enough money for groceries. I chose the path of least resistance because Dad favored me, and I was fundamentally terrified that if I pushed back in your defense, I would lose my executive allowance. I abandoned my brother to protect my balance sheet. I walked slowly across the concrete floor and sat down on the leather armchair directly opposite the steel staircase. I didn't offer him a tissue. I didn't offer a soft, comforting, everyday platitude. "I am not going to pretend that any of what happened is historically acceptable, Julian," I stated, my voice completely objective, calm, and entirely unyielding. "Not the financial amputation. Not the years I spent believing my mother's existence had been permanently wiped from the family archives. But I am also not going to carry that immense institutional burden anymore. Not for your emotional comfort. For my own operational liberation, I am definitively done allowing Charles Sterling's failures of vision to serve as the master title slide of my life's presentation." Julian wiped his nose with his sleeve, sniffing heavily. "What does that strategic decision mean for our relationship moving forward? Nate, are you formally executing a permanent legal severance against me?" "It means I do not hold historical hatred for you, Julian," I explained quietly. "I also do not offer you standard, everyday forgiveness. Not in the simple, tidy, unearned way people typically utilize that word to avoid genuine accountability. But I am willing to authorize a completely new operational trial. A relationship entirely disconnected from the historical sterling balance sheet. Just two deeply flawed, solitary adult men living in separate cities, attempting to figure out if there is any genuine human substance between us worth the tremendous, uncompensated effort of building. Julian looked at me, a tiny, fragile, desperate glimmer of profound human gratitude breaking across his exhausted face. I would like that operational possibility, Nate. I don't intellectually believe I deserve it, but I desperately want it. You absolutely do not deserve it, I confirmed simply. Neither did I deserve to be thrown onto the pavement at Grand Central 12 years ago. But I am choosing to authorize this initial term sheet anyway. When Julian finally stood up to collect his overcoat, he hesitated awkwardly by the elevator bank. Then, with a sudden, clumsy, desperate physical movement, he stepped across the boundary and wrapped both arms around my shoulders. It was a brief, highly uncoordinated, stiff embrace. The very first time my golden child brother had touched me in over a decade. I didn't squeeze back hard, but I didn't push him away. It was an honest, unvarnished, completely realistic start. I stood in my Tribeca doorway, silently watching the pneumatic elevator doors slide shut, isolating Julian as he began his long commuter journey back to Connecticut. As the mechanical latch engaged, I felt a final, definitive internal molecular shift. The very last stubborn, jagged piece of my historical puzzle clicked smoothly into its permanent, unassailable placement. I had spent 12 years of my life constructing a massive, undeniable external corporate leviathan that conclusively proved my family wrong. Now, I was finally, permanently free to devote the remaining decades of my existence to constructing an internal piece that had absolutely nothing to do with them whatsoever. I was Nathaniel Sterling. I had built a master empire from nothing but a complete refusal to disappear. I had checked my own edition, and I had conclusively survived the very individuals who should have loved me best. The morning winter sunlight flooded across my hardwood floor, catching the tiny, floating dust motes still suspended in the warm, quiet air. Outside, the great Leviathan of Manhattan was already roaring through its morning operational cycle, entirely oblivious to the domestic drama that had concluded in my foyer, and completely, beautifully indifferent to the absolute internal liberation I had finally found. I stepped back inside, took a slow, deep breath of clean air, and shut my heavy penthouse door in absolute, unbroken silence. To the incredible, resilient women listening to my voice right now, especially those of you who have spent decades sitting in the cold, unacknowledged corners of your own family structures, watching individuals with half your intelligence and zero human empathy absorb the credit for your silent, exhausting sacrifices. I want you to hear this one fundamental truth clearly. If you are currently being treated as invisible, if your historical contributions are being systematically omitted from the family presentation, do not believe the lie that your life lacks intrinsic valuation. The darkness of social or familial dismissal is not a burial ground. It is an incubator. It is the quiet, highly protected operational space where you systematically accumulate your strength, verify your own raw data, and sack your personal leverage while the inherently self-satisfied individuals around you sleep in their comfortable illusions. You do not need their validation to authorize your existence. You own the master balance sheet of your own soul. Stop measuring your magnificent, unyielding capacity for survival against the crude yardstick of their monumental failures of human imagination. Claim your operational placement, establish your absolute boundaries, and remember that sometimes the most exquisite, unassailable masterclass in complete victory is simply letting go of the need to prove anything to individuals who lack the basic strategic vision to see you clearly. Have you ever faced a similar domestic amputation or corporate exploitation within your own immediate network? How did you personally survive the blind spots? Please share the raw architecture of your story in the comments section below. Your historical testimony might be the exact diagnostic proof another woman needs to realize she is not operating alone. And before you close your terminal today, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like so we can continue navigating these complex, unmapped journeys of personal liberation together. Thank you for checking the edition with me tonight. Until the next boardroom convergence, stay steady, stay quiet, and never sell your pedigree for $300 again.